You're standing on the deck of a medieval ship, staring out at the endless horizon. The wind is in your hair, but so is the stench of unwashed bodies and spoiled food. You just embarked on a journey that could last weeks or months, and you have no idea what awaits you. Welcome to the world of medieval sailors. A world where survival wasn't just about navigating treacherous waters. It was about enduring conditions that would make even the toughest modern adventurer cringe. Today, we're going to explore how these brave souls managed to survive long voyages, from the food they ate to the diseases they faced. But first, let's set the scene. In the Middle Ages, sailing wasn't just a job, it was a way of life. From Viking explorers to merchant traders, sailors were the backbone of global commerce. They carried spices, textiles, and precious metals across oceans, connecting continents in ways that shaped history. But with every voyage came danger. Danger from the sea, from disease, and from the unknown. So how do they do it? Let's dive in. Imagine being hundreds of miles from land with nothing but the stars above and your instincts to guide you. No Google Maps, no compass, no radio, just hope. For medieval sailors, navigation was a high-stakes gamble against nature. They had no satellites, no digital charts, no instant communication. Every voyage into open waters was a leap into the unknown, and many never returned. So how did they find their way? It all came down to observation, experience, and a bit of luck. The most reliable tool at their disposal was the sky. The sun by day, the stars by night, especially Polaris, the North Star, which remained fixed in the northern sky and gave sailors a constant point of reference. They used simple instruments like the astrolabe and cross staff to measure the angle of the sun or stars above the horizon. These tools helped them estimate latitude, how far north or south they were, though not longitude, which remained a mystery until much later. But what if it was cloudy? Then they relied on dead reckoning, estimating their position based on speed, direction, and time traveled. This method was notoriously inaccurate, and errors could send ships hundreds of miles off course. Sailors also read the sea itself. The color of the water, the presence of birds, floating seaweed, or even the smell in the air could hint that land was near. Experienced navigators passed this knowledge down through generations like a secret code of the ocean. Still, despite these techniques, many ships vanished without a trace. Some ran aground on hidden reefs. Others drifted endlessly, their crews starving and dying of thirst. And some simply sailed into legend. Picture this. You've been at sea for weeks. There's no fridge, no fresh food, and the only thing keeping you from starvation is whatever was packed when the ship left port. What did medieval sailors eat on long voyages? Spoiler, it wasn't gourmet. The staple foods were dried biscuits, known as hardtack, salted meat or fish, and barrels of stale water or beer. That's right. Beer was often safer to drink than water because the brewing process killed bacteria. Hardtack was a rock-hard cracker made from flour and water, baked until all moisture was gone. It could last for months if it didn't get infested with weevils first. Sailors would soak it in broth or beer to soften it before eating, if they were lucky. Salted pork or beef was another common ration. The meat was cured heavily to prevent spoilage, but after weeks at sea, it often tasted rancid and was tough enough to break your teeth. Fresh fruit and vegetables were non-existent, which meant scurvy was a constant threat. Sailors' gums would swell, their teeth would loosen, and black spots would appear on their skin from internal bleeding. Many died from what we now know is a simple vitamin C deficiency. Water was stored in wooden barrels, and it rarely stayed clean. Algae, insects, and even small creatures sometimes floated inside. If you couldn't stomach the water, beer was your best bet. A typical sailor might drink up to a gallon of low-alcohol beer every day just to stay hydrated. But even with these rations, hunger was common. When supplies ran low, desperate measures followed. Rats became a delicacy, and some crews resorted to drawing lots to decide who would be sacrificed to feed the others. Survival on board wasn't just about navigating the seas. It was about surviving the plate, too. You've survived weeks at sea, But now a new enemy emerges, not from the waves or the sky, but from within your own body. Medieval sailors faced a constant battle against disease, infection, and poor hygiene. With no antibiotics, no understanding of germs, and limited medical knowledge, even the smallest injury could mean death. Imagine slicing your hand while repairing a sail. Back home, you'd clean it with soap and slap on a bandage. On board, you might rinse it in seawater. If you're lucky, then go right back to work. Within days, the cut swells, turns red, and throbs with pain. That's infection setting in. And without proper treatment, gangrene follows. The only solution? Amputation, often done with a rusted knife and no anesthesia. Dental problems were just as brutal. Toothaches had one cure: yanking the tooth out with pliers. If your gums started bleeding or your teeth loosened, scurvy was likely the cause. Without fresh fruit or vegetables, vitamin C deficiency ravaged the body. Your breath would stink, your mouth would bleed, and eventually, your teeth would fall out one by one. And don't forget about lice, fleas, and rats. The ship wasn't just full of sailors, it was crawling with parasites. Lice infestations were common, spreading diseases like typhus. Fleas jumped from rats to men, bringing plague with them. Rats themselves gnawed through food supplies, chewed on hair, and sometimes even nibbled on sleeping sailors' fingers. Worst of all, the smell. No running water meant no regular washing. Sweat, rotting food, and human waste clung to every surface. Sailors wore the same clothes for months, rarely changing or cleaning them. Some tried using vinegar or seawater to scrub off the grime, but it barely helped. There was no privacy either. Dozens of men crammed into tight quarters, sharing hammocks two at a time. Illness spread fast. One man coughing blood meant the whole crew feared for their lives. So how did they cope? Superstition played a big role. Sailors carried charms, muttered prayers, and made offerings to gods and sea spirits. Some believed that tossing coins overboard would calm storms. Others thought shaving their heads would prevent illness. But when push came to shove, there was only one true remedy: survival of the fittest. Those who stayed healthy did so by luck, strength, and sheer willpower. Many others simply vanished beneath the waves. You're soaked to the bone, freezing cold, and clinging to the rigging as waves crash over the deck like angry fists. The wind howls like a beast from hell, and lightning splits the sky in two. This is not a storm. This is nature's war on your ship. For medieval sailors, storms weren't just inconvenient. They were deadly. With no radar, no satellite tracking, and no way to predict what was coming, every voyage carried the risk of being caught in a tempest with nowhere to run. When a storm hit, it hit hard. Sudden squalls could rise out of nowhere, turning calm waters into chaos in minutes. Sailors scrambled to reef the sails before the wind tore them apart. A single misstep meant being thrown overboard, lost to the depths without a trace. The worst part? There was no escape below deck. Water poured in through cracks and hatches, soaking everything. Rations became soggy, ropes rotted faster, and morale plummeted. Some men went mad with fear, screaming prayers into the wind, while others simply gave up, waiting for death to take them. Ships weren't built to withstand hurricanes or typhoons. Wooden hulls groaned under the pressure of towering waves. Masts snapped like twigs. Rudder lines broke, leaving the ship helpless against the fury of the sea. Entire crews vanished without a trace, swallowed by the ocean like ghosts. Even if you survived the storm itself, the aftermath could be just as dangerous. Drifting off course meant weeks without sight of land. Supplies ran low. Hope faded. And then came the real nightmare: starvation, thirst, and madness. But some sailors learned to read the signs. They watched the clouds, felt the wind, listened to the birds. A sudden drop in temperature, a red sky at night, or a distant rumble. All were warnings that the sea was about to turn violent. And when the storm finally passed, what remained was silence. The kind of silence that only follows destruction. Drenched, exhausted, and forever changed, the survivors picked up the pieces and prayed the sea wouldn't take them next time. You've made it through storms, survived the food, and somehow avoided disease. But there's one more challenge that could break even the strongest sailor. Life on board with a crew of strangers in tight quarters for months at a time. Imagine living in a wooden box with 50 other men, all sweating, coughing, swearing, and sleeping inches apart. No privacy, no silence, just constant noise, tension, and the ever-present smell of sweat, salt, and sickness. There was no room for personal space. Hammocks were strung close together or shared between two men who took turns sleeping. Below deck, the air was thick with body odor, damp wood, and rotting food. Rats scurried between barrels, and lice spread like wildfire. Every man had a role. The captain commanded the ship, but his word wasn't always law. On long voyages, discipline was everything. A single fight could turn into mutiny. Punishments were swift and brutal. Lashings, keel-hauling, or even marooning if the crew voted for it. Sailors were organized by rank and skill. The quartermaster kept order among the crew and sometimes held more power than the captain. Boatswains oversaw maintenance and repairs. Lookouts spent hours high in the rigging scanning for land, enemy ships, or danger. Cooks worked over open flames in cramped spaces, preparing whatever food hadn't spoiled yet. Hierarchy mattered, but so did loyalty. In a world where death was always near, sailors relied on each other not just for survival, but for sanity. They sang songs together to pass the time, told stories of home, and gambled with dice carved from bone. But tensions ran high. Hunger, fear, and exhaustion turned small arguments into deadly brawls. Some captains enforced strict rules, others ruled through fear alone. And when supplies ran low, tempers flared faster than fire on dry wood. Mutiny was rare, but not unheard of. Sailors who felt wronged might plot in secret, waiting for the right moment to overthrow the officers. If caught, they faced execution, often by hanging from the yardarm as a warning to others. Despite the hardship, bonds formed. Men who sailed together for years became like brothers. Some returned home rich, others came back changed, hardened by the sea, haunted by what they'd seen and done. Life below deck was more than just work. It was survival, struggle, and brotherhood in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. After weeks at sea, with no land in sight and the same faces surrounding you every day, boredom could be just as dangerous as disease. Sailors needed something to keep their minds off hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. So they turned to music, stories, games, anything that could distract them from the harsh reality of life aboard a medieval ship. At night, when the work was done and the sails were secure, sailors gathered on deck or below to pass the time. Music was one of the most popular pastimes. Fiddles, flutes, and drums, simple instruments made from whatever materials were available, filled the air with rhythm and song. Sailors sang ballads about love, war, and home. Some songs warned of sea monsters or cursed ships. Others told tales of lost lovers and distant lands. Storytelling was another favorite. Each sailor had a tale to tell, some true, others exaggerated with each retelling. They spoke of strange islands, ghost ships, and treasures hidden beneath the waves. Some stories were warnings, like how to spot a storm before it hits, or what to do if a crewmate goes mad. Others were meant to scare, whispered late at night when the wind howled like a beast. Gambling was also common. Dice carved from bone, playing cards painted by hand, or even simple guessing games kept hands busy and minds sharp. A few coins or extra rations were often wagered, but cheating could get you thrown overboard. Laughter was rare, but precious. Jokes were crude, insults were brutal, and pranks were merciless. But for men who lived under constant threat of death, any moment of joy was worth holding on to. Even with all this, morale could still collapse. When supplies ran low, tempers flared. The captain or quartermaster would sometimes organize contests, races across the rigging, wrestling matches, or competitions to see who could throw a knife the farthest. Winners earned small rewards, extra food, better sleeping spots, or even a few hours off duty. And then there were the superstitions. Every sailor had one. Some carried charms against storms. Others refused to sail on certain days or avoided saying certain words. Some believed a woman on board brought bad luck, while others swore a female figurehead on the bow could calm the sea. But no matter how hard they tried to stay entertained, one truth remained: nothing could replace home. And for many sailors, the only thing keeping them going was the hope of returning to it. Why would anyone risk their life on a wooden ship with no GPS, bad food, and zero medical care? Because the rewards could be unimaginable. For medieval sailors, the sea was more than a danger. It was opportunity. It connected worlds. It carried wealth. And for those brave enough to face its horrors, it promised riches beyond imagination. Trade was the beating heart of medieval seafaring. Spices from the east, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, were worth more than gold in Europe. These exotic goods didn't just flavor bland medieval food. They masked the taste of rotting meat and elevated the status of those who could afford them. Merchants risked everything to bring these treasures across oceans. Venetian traders sailed through the Mediterranean, braving pirates and storms to reach ports like Alexandria and Constantinople. Portuguese explorers pushed down the coast of Africa, seeking gold, ivory, and slaves. In the North Sea, Hanseatic League ships ferried fish, wool, and timber between Germanic states and England. But trade wasn't the only reason men boarded ships and sailed into the unknown. Exploration was the great gamble. Some set sail with royal backing, others with nothing but dreams and a map drawn from rumor. They searched for new lands, faster routes, and glory that would echo through history. Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal funded voyages that mapped the West African coast, opening the door to future colonization. Christopher Columbus, though sailing much later, built on the legacy of these earlier explorers, and his journey changed the world forever. Sailors believed in the promise of discovery. They heard tales of islands filled with spices, cities made of gold, and lands untouched by kings. Whether real or myth, these stories kept them going, even when the sea tried to kill them every day. And then there were the Crusaders, religious warriors who sailed eastward to reclaim the Holy Land. Their journeys weren't about profit or knowledge. They were driven by faith, conquest, and politics. For them, death at sea was just another step toward divine judgment. So why take the risk? Because staying home meant a life of poverty, hunger, and servitude. At least at sea, there was a chance to rise above your station, to return rich, to become a legend. Of course, most never did. Most came back broken, sick, empty-handed, or not at all. But for the few who made it, who found new lands, returned with spices, or earned favor with nobles, the sea paid off. And so, generation after generation, men climbed aboard wooden ships, kissed their lucky charms, and sailed straight into the unknown. You've survived weeks at sea. You've dodged storms, endured starvation, and fought off disease. But just when you think the worst is over, a dark shape appears on the horizon. No flags fly from its masts. No royal banners mark its allegiance. It moves fast, too fast, and it's heading straight for you. This is every sailor's nightmare: pirates. In medieval times, the open sea wasn't just dangerous because of nature. It was crawling with human predators. Pirates, privateers, and rival navies prowled trade routes, waiting to ambush merchant ships loaded with gold, spices, and silks. If you were lucky, the attackers wanted your cargo, not your life. If you were unlucky, they wanted both. Pirates came in many forms. Some were rogue sailors who mutinied and turned to crime. Others were state-sponsored privateers, given official letters of marque to harass enemy ships. And then there were the true outlaws, ruthless bands who left no survivors. The most feared among them were the Barbary corsairs, raiding from North Africa and terrorizing Mediterranean shipping lanes. They captured ships, enslaved crews, and demanded ransom for prisoners. For a sailor, capture often meant years of hard labor in foreign chains, or worse. But pirates weren't the only threat. Warring kingdoms used their navies to attack commercial vessels suspected of aiding the enemy. A ship carrying wine from France could be seized by English warships if caught during a conflict. Sailors had to constantly watch for national flags and avoid disputed waters. So how did merchant ships defend themselves? They carried weapons. Crossbows, pikes, even primitive cannons were mounted on decks. Archers stood ready, firing arrows at approaching boats. Crews built wooden barricades to repel boarders, but once pirates got aboard, it was usually over. Some captains tried to outrun attackers, relying on speed and favorable winds. Others tried to bluff, flying false flags or pretending to be friendly until the last moment. But deception rarely worked twice. When all else failed, there was one final option: fight. Naval battles were brutal. Ships rammed each other, grappling hooks flew through the air, and men swung swords while trying not to fall into the sea. Blood ran across wooden planks, mixing with seawater. The screams of the wounded echoed over the waves. And if you lost, you were either killed, thrown overboard, or taken prisoner. Some were sold into slavery. Others were forced to join the pirate crew, becoming the very monsters they once feared. Surviving the sea meant more than just enduring nature. It meant surviving the people who ruled it like wolves in the dark. You've survived storms, fought off pirates, and outlasted disease. But now a new enemy creeps aboard your ship. Not with swords or cannon fire, but with swollen gums, loose teeth, and black spots blooming across your skin. This is scurvy, and it was one of the deadliest killers on long sea voyages. Before anyone understood vitamins, sailors set out on months-long journeys with no fresh fruit or vegetables. Their diets were packed with salted meat, dried biscuits, and stale beer, food that kept them alive, just barely but not healthy. At first, the signs were easy to ignore. A little weakness, some fatigue. Maybe your legs felt sore after climbing the rigging. But soon, things got worse. Your gums began to swell and bleed. Your teeth loosened in their sockets. You found bits of your own tooth floating in your bowl as you tried to eat. Bruises appeared out of nowhere, turning your skin into a canvas of purple and black. The wounds wouldn't heal. Even small cuts festered. Your joints ached like you'd been beaten. You felt weak, dizzy, and constantly cold. And then came the worst part: death by internal bleeding, unnoticed until it was too late. Scurvy wasn't just a disease. It was a slow, agonizing breakdown of the body. It hit sailors so hard because they had no idea what caused it. Without vitamin C, their bodies couldn't produce collagen, the protein that held their tissues together. Imagine watching your shipmates fall apart before your eyes. One man collapses while scrubbing the deck. Another dies in his sleep. By the time you reach land, half the crew might be gone. Some captains try to prevent scurvy by carrying sauerkraut, citrus juice, or vinegar. Not because they knew about vitamin C, but because they noticed these things helped sailors stay healthier. But most ships had no such protections. Even when fresh fruit became available near port, many crews refused to eat it, convinced that luxury food was for nobles, not working men. By the time scurvy struck, it was often too late. Men who survived were lucky, but they weren't the same. Many never fully recovered. Their bodies bore the scars. Their minds carried the horror. Scurvy didn't just kill bodies, it broke spirits. And yet, despite knowing how deadly it was, sailors kept sailing again and again, hoping this time would be different. You're halfway through your voyage. The sea has tested your body, your mind, and your will to survive. But there's one thing you need more than ever: news from home. In a medieval world, communication was slow, unreliable, and often dangerous. If you were lucky, a passing ship might carry letters or messages from the port you left weeks ago. If not, you might not hear anything until you returned, if you return at all. So how did sailors stay connected with the world they left behind? They relied on maps, messengers, and maritime networks that formed the early version of global communication. Maps were among the most valuable tools a captain could have. But unlike today's GPS or digital charts, medieval maps were often hand-drawn, incomplete, and filled with myths. Some showed sea monsters lurking in uncharted waters. Others marked places like "Here be dragons." Still, these maps were crucial. They helped captains avoid known dangers, plan routes, and share discoveries. Over time, as explorers returned with new knowledge, maps improved. Port-Oland charts, detailed coastal maps used by Mediterranean sailors, became some of the most accurate navigational tools of the era. But maps alone weren't enough. Information had to travel between ports, ships, and kingdoms. That's where messengers came in. Royal courts, merchant guilds, and trading companies sent trusted riders across land to deliver important documents. These riders traveled fast, changing horses at relay stations to keep moving day and night. But even then, a message from one city to another could take days or weeks. At sea, communication was even harder. Ships couldn't stop and ask for directions. If a crew spotted another vessel, they might try to signal it using flags, smoke, or mirrors reflecting sunlight. Sometimes they shouted across the water, hoping the wind carried their words far enough. Letters were precious cargo. Sailors wrote them before departure, sealing them with wax and trusting they'd reach their destination. Some families received letters months after their loved ones had already returned or died. For merchants, staying informed meant survival. A trader needed to know if a rival had undercut prices, if a war had broken out, or if a shipment had been seized. Misinformation could cost fortunes or lives. And then there were the rumors. Without newspapers, radio, or the internet, stories spread like wildfire. A single sailor claiming he saw a ghost ship or an island made of gold could start legends that lasted centuries. Despite the challenges, medieval seafarers built a network of communication that kept the world turning. Their maps, messages, and stories shaped trade, exploration, and history. And every time a ship reached its destination safely, it proved something powerful. Even in the darkest corners of the ocean, humanity found a way to stay connected. You've survived storms, battles, disease, and starvation. But just when you think you're safe, a loud creak echoes through the hull. Then a splash. Water begins rising from below deck. Your ship is taking on water, and if you don't fix it fast, you won't live to see land again. In medieval seafaring, ships were more than transportation. They were floating homes, fortresses, and lifelines. And like any home, they needed constant maintenance. The difference? There was no garage, no hardware store, and definitely no AAA roadside assistance. When something broke, sailors had to fix it themselves with whatever tools and materials they had on board. Wood was the main enemy of ships. Constant exposure to salt water made planks swell and shrink. Worms bored through the hull. Leaks formed in seams between boards. If left unchecked, even the sturdiest vessel could sink from nothing more than rot and neglect. So how did sailors keep their ships seaworthy? They patched leaks the old-fashioned way, by caulking. This meant stuffing tar or animal hair into the gaps between planks to stop water from seeping in. It was messy, back-breaking work that had to be done regularly, especially after long voyages. If a plank cracked or rotted completely, they replaced it, but only if they had spare wood. Some ships carried extra timber for emergency repairs. Others scavenged broken masts or damaged cargo crates to patch up the hull. Rigging was another weak point. Ropes frayed under constant strain. Sails tore in high winds. Masts snapped during storms. Sailors climbed the rigging like spiders, splicing new ropes, sewing torn sails, and reinforcing weak points before disaster struck. And then there were the barnacles. Yes, barnacles. Over time, these hard-shelled creatures clung to the bottom of ships, slowing them down and making them harder to steer. To remove them, crews had to careen the ship, tilt it sideways in shallow water, and scrape the hull clean by hand. It was grueling, dangerous work that left the ship vulnerable to attack. But sometimes the worst damage came from within. Fire was every sailor's nightmare. One careless spark near stored gunpowder or oil lamps could reduce the entire ship to ashes. Fire started easily. Cooking accidents, lightning strikes, or even spontaneous combustion from oil-soaked rags. When flames took hold, there was little anyone could do except pray and grab a lifeboat. Still, despite all the dangers, medieval sailors became masters of improvisation. They patched holes with barrels, sealed cracks with wax, and turned everyday objects into life-saving tools. Because out on the open sea, survival didn't just depend on luck or strength. It depended on knowing how to keep your ship alive, even when the ocean tried to kill it. You've survived disease, hunger, storms, and enemies. But there's one thing that haunts every sailor, not from the sea or sky, but from within: fear. In medieval times, fear wasn't just a feeling, it was a force. A force that shaped decisions, drove rituals, and ruled life aboard ships where death was always just one wave away. And for sailors, the only thing stronger than fear was faith. Religion was the anchor of medieval life, and nowhere was it more powerful than on a ship in the middle of an endless ocean. With no land in sight and nature as unpredictable as a king's temper, sailors turned to God, saints, and spirits for protection. Before every voyage, ships were blessed by priests. Candles were lit in churches, prayers were whispered, and holy water was sprinkled across decks to ward off evil. Some captains carried relics, bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, believing they could calm storms and scare off sea monsters. Every crew had its own spiritual traditions. Some said Mass before dawn. Others kept icons or crucifixes nailed to the mast. Sailors wore charms, medallions, and even tattoos believed to offer divine protection. But faith alone wasn't enough. Superstition filled the gaps where religion left questions unanswered. Sailors lived by signs, omens, and rituals passed down like sacred laws. A bird flying from left to right meant good luck. A bird flying the other way? Bad news. Seeing a dolphin near the ship was a sign of safety. Seeing a shark meant danger was near. Some crews refused to sail on Fridays, believing it was the day Jesus died and would bring misfortune. Names were powerful. Some ships were never called by their real name while at sea. Instead, they were given nicknames to trick evil spirits. Saying whale out loud was considered bad luck, so sailors called them the finner instead. Even the way you packed your bags mattered. It was bad luck to bring a Bible written in red ink. Bringing a woman on board was thought to anger the sea itself, though some captains secretly brought female figures carved into the bow to appease it. Dreams were taken seriously. A nightmare about drowning meant something. A dream of home meant you might not return. And then there were the ghosts. Stories of cursed ships haunted the minds of even the bravest men. The Flying Dutchman legend started centuries later, but medieval sailors told their own versions. Ghost ships seen drifting silently through fog, with dead crews staring blankly ahead. Faith and fear walked hand in hand. One gave hope. The other kept you alert. Because on the open sea, where the horizon was your only guide and the wind whispered secrets no one could understand, you didn't just need a strong ship. You needed something watching over you. You've seen how brutal life at sea could be. The food, the diseases, the storms, and the enemies lurking beyond the horizon. But some sailors didn't just survive, they did the impossible. Let's look at real stories of medieval seafarers who faced death at sea and lived to tell the tale. One of the most famous survival stories comes from the voyage of St. Brendan, an Irish monk who supposedly sailed across the Atlantic in the 6th century. While much of his journey is wrapped in legend, medieval sailors believed he reached lands far beyond Europe, perhaps even North America centuries before Columbus. His crew reportedly encountered floating islands, giant birds, and seas that burned with fire. Whether true or not, these tales inspired generations of sailors to believe the ocean held secrets worth discovering. Then there's the story of Jean de Mandeville, a 14th century traveler whose accounts describe journeys through the Middle East, India, and even China. Though many details were exaggerated or borrowed from other sources, his writings gave Europeans a glimpse into the wider world and showed how far one determined sailor could go if he had the will and courage. Another incredible account comes from the Genoese sailor Pietro Carini, who was shipwrecked near Norway in 1432 during a violent storm. Separated from most of his crew, he and a handful of survivors washed up on the remote island of Rost in northern Norway. With no way to sail back, they spent the winter among the locals, learning how to survive in a land as harsh as the sea. Eventually, They built a new boat using local materials and returned home, proving that even when the ocean tried to kill you, it sometimes offered a second chance. There are also records of Portuguese explorers who ventured down the coast of Africa in the 15th century. One such voyage involved Diogo Chao, who sailed thousands of miles along unknown shores, surviving scurvy, mutiny, and hostile encounters with indigenous people. His maps helped lay the groundwork for future exploration and showed how crucial preparation, leadership, and resilience were to survival. And let's not forget the countless unnamed sailors who endured months at sea with little more than faith and hope. Some wrote journals describing their struggles, how they rationed food, fought off pirates, and prayed to gods they barely understood. These documents give us rare glimpses into the minds of men who braved the unknown without guarantees. Each of these stories reminds us that survival wasn't just about luck. It was about skill, adaptability, and the human spirit's refusal to give up, no matter how deep the ocean or how dark the night. You've seen what life was like for medieval sailors, the brutal conditions, the dangers of the unknown, and the sacrifices they made to explore new worlds. But their struggles weren't in vain. In fact, everything we take for granted today, global trade, modern navigation, even the way we communicate across oceans, has roots in the bravery and ingenuity of these early seafarers. Let's start with something simple: globalization. Without medieval sailors, there would be no globalization. The world wouldn't have connected the way it did. Trade routes established by Venetian merchants, Portuguese explorers, and Hanseatic traders laid the foundation for the interconnected economy we live in today. The spices that once cost more than gold. They helped fuel economic growth and cultural exchange across continents. The maps drawn by medieval cartographers evolved into the charts that still guide ships today. And the compass, first used widely in Europe during the Middle Ages, became one of the most important tools in human history. Then there's exploration. The age of discovery didn't just begin in the 15th century. It was built on centuries of maritime experience. Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan didn't invent ocean travel. They inherited knowledge passed down from generations of medieval sailors who risked everything to push beyond the horizon. And let's not forget about science. The need to navigate accurately led to advances in astronomy, mathematics, and timekeeping. The astrolabe, once a tool used by medieval sailors to find latitude, later influenced instruments used by astronomers and scientists for centuries. Even language and culture were shaped by medieval seafaring. As ships traveled between ports, so did ideas, beliefs, and customs. Words, recipes, and traditions crossed oceans long before mass media existed. Sailors were the original influencers, bringing stories, goods, and innovations back home that changed societies forever. Perhaps most importantly, medieval sailors taught us about human resilience. They showed that people could endure extreme hardship, adapt to new environments, and thrive under pressure. Their survival strategies, from food preservation to ship maintenance, inspired future generations of explorers, soldiers, and adventurers. Today, we take for granted the ability to cross oceans in hours, to send messages instantly across the globe, and to know exactly where we are at any given moment. But none of this would exist without those brave souls who sailed into the unknown, guided only by the stars, their instincts, and an unshakable belief that something better lay beyond the horizon. So next time you look out at the sea, or even board a plane that crosses an ocean, remember them, because the world we live in today was built one voyage at a time.